Beast. A story by user Jake the Snake Bake Cake. Chapter 6. As the ship beast rounded another corner under the tail's direction, he ran into more than he had bargained for. The man suddenly leapt backwards and crashed into the crew members behind him. They sang out in surprise. Some even pointed their weapons at him. Releasing his passenger, the ship beast brought up a finger to his lips and shushed them with a quick burst of air. Met with only confused and anxious looks, he tried another gesture of curling fingers as he slowly moved to approach the corner yet again. As they peered around into the next hall, the crew and their ship beast were presented with a view of narrowly avoided danger. Over a dozen of their bloodthirsty intruders were milling about up ahead. In their midst was a long, hollow vent, which seemed to have diagonally pierced the ceiling. As another creature slipped out of it, it occurred to the human that this was their point of entry. The wart-covered beings were performing some type of complicated operation on a giant set of doors which sealed the end of the hallway, and the air seemed thick with the smell of burnt metal. Their irritated shouts and gurgles rebounded with the sounds of metal drilling and sparks flying. Whatever was at the end of the hall was of great importance to the invaders. Ducking back past the armed crew, the ship beast came to a stop and crouched before its wounded companion. The passenger it had set down against the hallway had certainly seen better days. Though her leg had apparently stopped bleeding and seemed to have healed over slightly, her solid green eyes seemed to be dulled, and her song of recognition was weak. The pale flesh around the wound seemed to have taken a slightly lighter shade of blue than the blood which stained the white uniform around it, and gave off the impression of pain. De Hare watched as crew members peeked their heads individually to check the hall again and fiddled with their weapons. Only the steward and shipmaster Yatale had ever really handled the things, and the crew members likely didn't know how to use them at all. She had not caught a solid glance before the beast had pushed her back behind the safety of the walls, but the quiet, anxious rhythms told her more than enough of what had lain in wait. It was nothing good. As those songs died, the crew eventually settled to look at the beast. It stared back at them, and offered them nothing in return of their silence but its own. She'd begun to come to terms with its intelligence. The creature was quiet and unreadable, but it had been a huge mistake to presume it stupid. She wondered how much of her speech it understood. Opening her mouth, she sang a familiar greeting to it. It waited a moment as it held the gazes of the crew, before it finally turned once more to her. At first she had thought that it was looking for guidance or instruction, but now she felt differently. The ship beast was covered in wounds that seemed the opposite of healing despite its massive strength. Burns covered its torso, and though none had pierced its hide, exhaustion was evident upon its strange features. The clear blood began to run from its strange eyes as it stared at her. It seemed focused on her leg, and when she motioned at her wound it seemed to grow agitated. She could almost hear the tendons in its arms creaking as its fingers clenched into a solid ball. Soft pops were audible as its joints creaked and pressure released, and De Hare tried not to think about how much strength the creature in front of her possessed. Anger radiated off of it as much as heat did, as if it was burning fusion fuel on the lowest setting. It was like an oven in the cold air of the ship. They had said it ate more than 5 of them put together, but she hadn't believed that until she spent a whole sleep cycle on its back. Its metabolism was unheard of, and if she looked carefully, her eyes could actually make out what seemed to be steam rising off of its skin. The ship was beginning to chill faster now, which meant their life support had been forced to focus the particle field in one location for some tremendous output. In all likelihood, it was drawing power from anything it could to simply keep the air within the ship. They were quite likely going to freeze to death in the length of a few rotations if the situation didn't improve. A heavy cough came from the beast, and she saw something red drip from the creature's strange snout. It wiped it away and showed her its teeth while curling back its lips. The terrifying gesture apparently meant something other than wanting to eat her, though she wasn't totally certain what. De Hare didn't understand the ship beast any more than it did her, but she had finally grasped that her pain, and the pain of others seemed to impact it. The blood from its eyes was not solely from physical wounds. The way it had stared at her fallen comrades and had flinched at her sobs, it understood. It understood, and it was angry. Very, very angry. Suddenly it rose up and turned away from her, a liberated sword gripped in each hand. Its walk was steady and determined as it passed the crew, and its shoulders seemed to tense as it took massive gulps of air. She sang out again in quiet clarity, a melody of regret and respect. They couldn't speak a word to one another, but she had understood. There was an apology in that song, and the ship beast turned for one last look over its shoulder. It set one sword down, brought its feet together, and in a strangely formal gesture, brought its right hand to its forehead. The crew stared, and the creature stared back. One by one they brought their hands to their foreheads in a mimic of the gesture. The ship beast showed its teeth one more time, and let out a puff of air in an amused fashion, before retrieving the weapon at its feet. Without any further warning, it lifted the sword to its shoulder, tensed its muscles, and rounded the corner where almost certain death awaited. Yatale was barely conscious as the thing casually carved into her. The tail was only partly flayed, but it had decided to focus on her other parts in its stead. The creature had trimmed a sliver off of her right arm, and then seemed to shift to her legs while it chewed the strips of her flesh and hair with relish. She was bleeding from countless of such strips at this point, covering her entire body. And when it stopped to bark orders to its fellow raiders, she had wished simply for death to release her. As it turned back, she realized she didn't have long to wait, as it brought out another blade with a serrated edge. Its jaws pulled back into a large, predatory grin as it brought this down to her belly and began to apply pressure. She screamed with all her remaining strength. She didn't want to die like this. Please, not like this. Suddenly, the creature tensed and began heaving blood in desperate gasps, covering her flayed skin and torn cloak in deep green gore. She could make out the end of a blade that had impaled it so deeply the point had burst from its chest. The creature coiled in death's embrace as it fell off of her, contracting with a loud rattling sound. Yatale turned her head with the last of her strength to find her rescuer. Instead, she found art. It was in its purest form, the beautiful, gruesome dance of death. Her ship beast was in combat. With its back to her, in a protective posture, the creature flowed with grace, from one strange form to the next. Each movement had a purpose. Each placement of those powerful limbs had a target. The mask had fallen off. The curtains had dropped. And the disguise of a benign beast was no more. In its place was a god of retribution, a being of death. Muscles tensed, stretched, released. Soft impacts of its feet seemed to pit and pat like raindrops as it moved. It shot its legs out in kicks, which seemed to ripple the very air upon their impact, and jumped with such strength that it seemed to fly. The raiders were hard-pressed just to hold their ground as it spun between them. Some darted around and attempted to leave the beast to the others, while they went to finish the job at hand. If that maneuver had worked on past ships, it failed completely here. If a creature tried to break rank and approach her instead, the beast shifted like the discharge of a light round. More than one being had ended up splattered against the wall of the bridge by a brutal body slam. The enemy boarding party tried again and again to bring it down. Again and again they failed, for the beast fought with disturbing speed. The enemies that attempted to overwhelm it were broken in quick bursts of deadly force as the Guardian's reaction time proved far more capable than their own. One of the six-limbed pirates leapt at the beast in a suicidal attempt to end the matter once and for all, its blade held high above its head, with multiple limbs for a downward stab. Turning just in time, the ship beast angled its torso and rotated at the hips to strike out with its paw, or fist. It mattered not the terminology to Yatale, because the impact literally ripped the head of the attacking alien from its shoulders and ruined the trajectory of its weapon. Blood showered in a green mist behind the impact. The sword slid down the ship beast's back as the creature's headless body crashed into the beast, and for the first time Yatale saw it bleed for true. And for the first time, Yatale saw it truly bleed. Blood, as red as her home planet's star, dripped from the long, dark gash. Her ship guardian seemed to tremble in pain as it fell to one knee, heaving heavily. It was then that she saw how grave the situation truly was. When it was in motion, it had seemed unstoppable, as if a force of nature. But now that it had stopped, she could assess the damage. Burns covered it, and its skin was discolored with purple and black bruises where the burns had not yet reached. It must have fought many times before arriving at the bridge. Taking advantage of the temporary ceasefire that had occurred, the remaining raiders had drawn their firearms and let out a volley of everything those contained. The wave of light rounds struck it, and the beast reacted quickly in a practiced maneuver, raising its arms together as a shield, blocking the shots aimed at its face and eyes. From where she lay, she could smell its flesh, which burned and smoked in sudden spots of scar tissue. It held its guard through the onslaught, guarding its eyes, and waited. Red blood dripped on the floor in a slow and steady rhythm. It waited. Finally the shots lessened, then ceased, as the boarding party attempted to reload. The beast wasn't dead, and though it wasn't moving, none of the pirates seemed to want to go closer and finish it by hand. Their panic and fumbling with their reloading reached a fever pitch as the Guardian began to move again, slowly forcing its limbs into motion with one heavy inhalation at a time. Surely the thing must be incapacitated by now. But defying all logic, it picked up the sword that had sliced open its back, still dripping red with its blood, and marched forward towards the remainder of its opponents. Their screams died as the sword fell with speed, the likes of which Yatale had never seen. This was a creature of legend. Soon, there was nothing but silence. The beast walked unsteadily down the hall away from the carnage, and away from the bleeding shipmaster and her stunned crew. Its slow, steady steps took it down the ramp and around the corner, without stopping to so much as glance at them. Quiet songs of disbelief and fear rang out behind her, and she felt the touch of her spawn. Their faces were so deeply sad as they laid their hands upon her shoulders and cheek. Those places may be the only portions of her that would remain unscarred. Not even a medical unit could fix these wounds entirely. Yatale remained silent, and fought back the song of agony and sadness as her wounds ached. She couldn't bring herself to speak as she stared at the corner. Their enemies were dead, and they were safe, but at what cost? What did it matter if the invaders were replaced by a demon of her own making? A creature that might casually murder them with ease if they set it off. She had been a true fool to think she was ready for a ship beast. A true fool. Her song of agony was beginning to pierce her lips when she saw them. Her view of the hall was filled as they came walking up the ramp. One by one, surviving crew began to appear, and one by one they began to embrace their fellows, who walked forward to meet them. She fought with everything she had to hold back her song of pain, with all she had, as the creature returned with a wounded crew member on its blood-covered back. It was only after it laid the medical officer down with what appeared to be a measure of careful restraint that the beast returned to Yatale and approached. It seemed to shake with effort as it brought itself down to the ground on its knees. Slowly, it pointed to her, its arms covered in burns, its chest coated in many more. It pointed to her and her scars, while its hands seemed to waver in fierce trembling. It curled up its lips, to reveal its large white teeth, and took a single deep breath before collapsing backwards. Her wounded medical officer seemed to struggle, trying over and over to rise. Second medical engineer Deher, if Yatale's memory was still serving her. The girl was barely lucid, and her singing soft, but Yatale could make out the words clearly in the silence that held over the ship. Her words repeating, over and over, even as she gasped out in pain. "This is no beast, shipmaster. This is no beast." With a heavy sigh, the creature on the floor next to her exhaled as it closed its eyes. The guardian of her ship moved no more, but the strange gesture of its lips remained, curled back into a deep grin. Zort had fled back to his ship after he watched the first 5 of his men on the bridge being torn apart by the vicious animal. It was like nothing he had ever seen. The perfect killing machine. Beyond the point of absurdity, the damned thing was fracking smart. He had watched it pick up and fire a light rifle with accuracy, drop it, and pick up a sword in time to intercept one of his most vicious crew members, and then promptly decapitate him. That thing was straight from the nightmares of a forbidden planet, the kind that used to exist in the distant millennia before intelligent life took to the stars. Such things should no longer exist, and should certainly not exist in some random no-name trader's ship in the middle of bumfuck nowhere. That was a guardian beast from hell itself. How a shipmaster came to tame it, Zort couldn't even comprehend. To make matters worse, he was locked in place. The injector held his ship as firmly as it held theirs, and he couldn't detach without a crew to operate the mechanism at its mouth. That crew just happened to be scattered all over the walls now, and Zort had a feeling he would be too if he didn't make haste. Combination codes were entered rapidly by each of Zort's 4 upper limbs. He'd be damned before he died over some shitty trade ship. Perhaps it was time to consider retirement. Zort entered the ship life pod, the only one he had ever installed. It held everything he could need, and a little extra. He had never had to use it, and generally speaking, pirates had little use for such things. Their field of work was something of a total commitment, and escape usually wasn't an option. Zort was uncharacteristic in that regard, though. He had always liked having a backup plan. As he punched the button to eject, he wondered momentarily if he had forgotten anything important. As the pod prepared to launch, he checked the systems. Everything seemed normal. He even had his currency in a digitized format built into the hard system. He could land rich on any civilized planet and live like nobility without issue. As the life pod launched from the ship with a tremendous burst of speed, he was still wondering what he had forgotten, and he kept wondering until he was ripped from existence by an asteroid. Wrecks were almost unheard of in recent times. Almost. Pain. Terror. Liquid seemed to permeate every pore and crevice in his lungs. Drowning and confused, he tried to scream. His eyes opened to a blurred vision. He was completely submerged. Flailing wildly, he felt the walls of his container and realized his lungs were full of the unfamiliar fluid. Then he realized he could breathe. Slow, shallow breaths followed, and he fought the urge to cough the liquid from his lungs with every single one of them. Torture beyond imagining. It was a small glass pod in which he lay, and outside it he saw there were several others like it, containing wounded crew members. A familiar face peered over the top of his strange confinement, and a happy song rang out, strangely clear despite the liquid. If his eyes were functioning properly, it seemed his optimistic companion had survived their boarding, and was doing far better than he was. The confusion was settling as the pieces fell into place. The battle had been won, the ship was safe, and he was alive. Alive and extremely uncomfortable. Slowly the liquid in the pod began to drain away, putting him into a bizarre limbo of coughing and gasping as the liquid left and the air returned. His lungs could be made to breathe the liquid, but they certainly couldn't be made to like it. The cold air didn't help matters much either. As the last of the liquid was drained, the ceiling of his pod dissipated with a sudden rush, allowing him to sit up. He did so quickly, trying to heave the last bit of the strange fluid from his throat, and rose. In between his coughing, the man desperately tried to get his bearings. Slowly, he began to pull in the scene of activity around him. Almost every section of the room was broadcasting some type of holographic display, the closest of which seemed to show a complex scan of his body. He recognized some of the organs which glowed with the artificial illumination, and watched with morbid curiosity as his heart beat in synchronization of the display. Behind the display were several crew members dressed in white clothing, and buzzing quick alert notes to one another in heated discussion as others monitored similar pods spread out around the room. A light touch upon his shoulder made him turn, and he found 2 pure green eyes disturbingly close to his face. He flinched back, which brought a strange laughing song from the alien. As she stared at him, she pointed to her leg, and cocked her head slightly to one side. She spoke again, and pointed to him, and then to his throat. She was looking for some type of response, maybe recognition. Of course he recognized her. He had spent half a day keeping her alive on his back while listening to her sing him into battle after battle. He instinctively tried to speak, momentarily forgetting about his scarred throat, and found that he could. His voice croaked out a greeting that was more cough than words, but it was there. She was the one who flinched in shock this time. The green eyes widened, and a strange, quick pulse of notes rang out. The Doppler effect was almost notable when she ran off in a sudden burst of speed, favoring her uninjured leg only slightly. Others in the room jumping out of her way in surprise. He sat stunned and tried to speak again. His voice was rough, but it was there. "I can speak." The words carried more meaning than he had ever imagined, and he repeated them again and again as he felt his throat. The scars were still there, but they were less than before. In fact, as he looked over his arms and chest, he realized he could barely make out the burns which had covered him. They were there, but in the same way a scar from years of fading was there, barely recognizable. The voice of his companion lofted back into the room as she turned the corner into the medical bay, followed by several others. They trailed in with hushed voices, emotion indistinguishable but posture tense. The last of them wore a cape of scales. It was the one with the brace. He felt at his neck again and realized that the collar was still there, but it seemed to have melded, slowly becoming part of his skin. With a light touch he tried to slip his finger along its edge, but found none. He doubted it could ever be removed without taking his head with it. The skin had fused. An odd sensation to say the least, but on the bright side it didn't itch. A 6-fingered hand touched his, and brought his attention away from the collar and back to the happy green glow of his friend in white. She pointed to her mouth with her other hand and made a motion with a single note. She then pointed to the alien wearing the scales as she tugged lightly, pulling him from his strange perch on the residual medical pod piece. As he rose from his seat and set bare feet upon the cold metal floor, he felt intense vertigo. The world seemed to sway, and he felt the toll of physical movement in one enormous wave. Unable to steady himself, he fell to his knees and found himself staring at the edge of a scaled cloak. A scarred tail was greeting him. The blue fur that covered most of it was gone for the last foot. It was simply pale blue flesh. Her legs had similar scars, as did almost all of her visible body. Her wounds had not faded as well as his, though he lacked any true fur to provide a reasonable contrast. Tendons and muscles screamed in agony as he pulled himself up, to match and then surpass the shipmaster's height. He towered over her now, and as he faced her he tried to keep anger from rolling out in tidal surges. She was the reason he had been in such pain, like an animal on display. He wanted nothing more than to give back with interest. But he didn't. Her scars and the memory of what had happened to her made him cringe with something close to pity. No one deserved what had happened to her. The added influence of a light pressure on his left arm kept him from falling again, and reminded him of a crucial detail. He had saved their lives. A long breath left his chest as he mentally willed away his anger. It would serve him nothing to act on impulse and rage. The time for that was past. Instead, he simply asked the question that had been on his mind since his first true moment of clarity in this strange existence. Why am I here? Quiet murmurs came from the crew, and a few notes of pride came from his companion, gripping his arm with slight but determined strength. The one with the scaled cloak shifted and reached into a pouch at her waist. Stepping back uncomfortably, he cautiously raised his arm in defense. Last time she had reached for something, he had been put in more pain than one could ever wish to experience. It wasn't something someone simply got over. She seemed to notice because she slowed immediately, and then handed a small device carefully to his companion, who then passed it to him. A small game of trust. The scarred tail seemed to swish nervously. It was a small hollow ball that slid open to show 2 small discs, which looked as though they were made of thin, clear rubber. Carefully, his companion took one from his hand and slowly lifted it to his left temple. It stuck there with a slight zap, and began to usher in a strange list of sensations one could only really describe by using sounds for color and smells for sight. The vertigo returned with a vengeance, and his brain felt as though it had been lit on fire. Tiny shocks were running through his skull. A tingle similar to when the collar had been first slapped around his neck emerged soon after. He tried to back away, but stopped in shock when he heard her. "He is so frightened, Yatale. He barely trusts me." His friend was speaking English. He was as perplexed as he was amazed. She mistook the pause as acceptance because she quickly lifted the other disc to his right temple. It sealed quickly with another short sensation of electricity. For a being of such strength and bravery in combat, it seems surprisingly skittish, the cloaked alien replied. "How soon until the discs take effect, Deher?" "I believe..." The green-eyed face stared at him now, her solid green eyes meeting his own. "I believe that they already have." She waited patiently now, staring at him with deep concentration, and a gesture that he was suddenly able to interpret as optimism and hope. She had given him a translator. She had realized he was intelligent. He took a deep breath and tried to speak. "Yes, I believe so." Those were the words that emerged from his lips as he imagined them. But his voice seemed to fly into the air in a much stranger pattern. He clamped his mouth shut in shock. To think in a familiar tongue, but to speak in the melody of an alien language, was disconcerting to say the least. In fact, the sensation was downright unnerving, as if a stranger was using his voice. He ground his teeth as he came to terms with it. Deher gasped in shock and leapt in excitement, dragging his as she did. "I knew it!" She turned to the cloaked one, named Yatale if he had understood correctly. "He isn't some feral beast." Well, what in Sayo's blue rings is he, then? A creature built for combat? A being of war? This creature killed an entire raiding party of Sagat shock troops by itself. Why haven't we ever heard of such a species before? Yatale turned to him now, and her blue eyes studied with careful distance. "What are you?" "I am human." The voice sang from his throat. It was difficult to tell the difference from speaking now, which just added to the strangeness. It seemed to be solidifying in some way. "I come from a planet called Earth?" He paused for a moment, and then he admitted the truth. "I remember very little of my life before the auction in which you collared me." Yatale grew uncomfortable after that statement. Perhaps it was the guilt of inflicting pain on another intelligent species, Or perhaps she was remembering that the brace on her wrist was broken as thoroughly as he could possibly have managed. That had been the only power she possessed that could bring even a measure of control over him, and upon reflection he would find that quite unnerving in her position. Instead of providing insight for these observations, she simply asked another question. "Where is Earth? I have never heard of such a planet." "I do not know." Honesty seemed to sing from him. Their language seemed to emphasize emotions as much as words. Another similarity to mankind, true emotions. "Though I remember little with certainty, I do not believe my kind has reached the technology to travel space as we seem to be doing now." He glanced to the porthole window of the medical bay and looked at the strange glimmer beyond it. "I think the planets which orbit our sun is as far as we've physically gone." He trailed off in thought. "Maybe slightly farther." He honestly wasn't sure if that was true. It just seemed like it was true. A subtle recognition registered when he spoke. Looking up, he saw disbelief upon the faces of everyone around him. "Your people are not true spacefaring?" Yatale asked in shock. "They have not even left their home system?" She seemed flustered now. "What technology do your people possess? Can you remember any details?" He stared at her in confusion now. These were strange questions. His head throbbed all of a sudden, and bits of memory seemed to leak into his thoughts. He tried not to cry in pain, but he felt a slow, growling song drop from his lips as the visions flew through his mind's eye. Giant battlecruisers decorated the space orbiting the colony. Explosions and death among the stars. Lights flashed. He remembered his fighter, his decelerators failing as his ship spun away from the battle. He remembered his blood leaking onto the control panel as the biogel sealed his wounds. He remembered his radio crackling with the sounds of a losing battle, and the sealing, bitter cold of forced cryosleep. It was painfully obvious to him now why he might not remember. Why he might not ever remember. "I cannot. I have tried, but I cannot." The lie was obvious to him, as it must have been to them. He didn't realize how much his language lacked until he had spoken theirs. An image of Earth being surrounded by the burning light of the sun hit him like a physical blow, and another low growl of pain sung quietly from his lips. "You attempt deception. Why is this?" Yatale's voice was cold and clear as she leveled her gaze. "To lie is considered a great offense in our culture, most of all to a shipmaster while on board her very vessel." "When you put this collar on my neck and brought me to this ship, what purpose was I to fill?" He let it hang in the air. His voice echoed slightly off the metal walls. Answer a question with another question. The tail seemed to flutter again. The nervous whipping returned. "I brought you to be a ship beast, a personal guardian for myself and my ship." Yatale's voice was steady as she replied, but the hand holding her bracer on her wrist was not. He stared at her and said nothing for a moment to let it sink in. The nervousness, combined with the strange foreign insight provided by the translator, was confirming his suspicions. She had not informed the crew. She may not have informed anyone at all. "I believe there are some things neither of us wish to say." He flexed his hands along the edge of a pod, rolling them into a fist to crack his knuckles one at a time. They rang out in long, dull clunks, reverberating with the glass. "I apologize for the insult." The tension in the air clung thick. Deher mumbled a song of confusion as she held his arm. Yatale simply stared at him. She knew that he understood the gravity of what had just occurred, and she knew there was nothing to do about it. This human had not revealed much of anything useful to her. Aside from the fact it was capable of single-handedly killing a ship's worth of armed individuals, and that it knew the obedience collar fusing to his neck was incapable of preventing him from doing it again without a functioning brace. Ytale had to admit, De Hare had been right on all counts. It was no beast. It might be much worse. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this one today. Thank you so much for being with me. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, subscribing, clicking the like button, doing all of the things. I don't know. Thanks for being a person. Thank you for putting your cart away at the grocery store. I really appreciate that. Thank you for saying thank you to fast food workers. Thank you for asking them how they're doing today. Thank you for just being a person, guys. Thank you. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Click on the Patreon link if you want to, coming up here in just a second. Bloop! And, all right, so what should I ask about this week? When was your first kiss? Yeah, sure. Why not? When was your first kiss? How old were you? Who was it? What did they mean to you? Are you still with them? Did you end up, regretting that? Was it pivotal? All that kind of stuff. Anyway, guys, I'll talk to you later. Bye, y'all. I forgot to tell you I love you. I'm so sorry. Bye, BB.